Good evening, class. This is Mrs. Albright, and tonight we are working on Module 5, Lesson 14, and our objective this evening is to use reasoning and use benchmarks to compare two fractions. When we talk about a benchmark, we're talking about like an anchor, something that we know. So using what we know about 1, 1/2, and 0 to identify where our fraction is on a number line and use that to compare which fraction is greater or less than the other. Before we start working with fractions, let's look at some simpler items. When I look at this image, I can ask myself, what is greater, 3 apples or 2 apples? Well, we all know that 3 apples is greater than 2 apples. And the reason we know that is because the unit that we're dealing with is the same. On both sides of this balance here, we're dealing with apples. So if the units are the same, we only need to look at the number of units to determine which one is greater or less. Now in this scenario, I have to think a little bit differently. Here, the number of units that I have is the same. On one side I have 2 apples, on this side I have 2 pineapples. So we can't look at the number of units to determine which sides of this is greater. We have to look at the size of the unit. We know that a pineapple is going to be much larger than an apple. So 2 pineapples would be greater than the 2 apples. So when we're comparing fractions, it's the same thing. We can either look at the size of the unit if the number of units is equal, like this situation, or like the one just before that, if the size of the unit is the same, then we can just count the number of the units. So you'll see what I mean when we get into our fraction problems. Here we have 1/4 and 3/4. In this instance, I know that the size of my units is the same, just like my first problem where I was counting the apples. They're all fourths. So I just need to look at the number of units. On this side I have 1, on this side I have 3, and 3 is greater than 1. So I would say 1/4 is less than 3/4. On this problem, the things that this fraction have in common are the number of units. The size of my units is different. I know that a 1/4 is going to be a bigger piece than a 1/5 is. Kind of like my pineapple was a bigger piece of fruit than my apple. And as long as the number of units are the same, I've got 1/4 and 1/5. If I know that a 1/4 is a bigger piece, then I can answer this expression and say that 1/5 is less than 1/4. This next problem, we want to look and see what do these two fractions have in common. And in this instance, it is the number of units. The size of the units is different. But I know that fourths are bigger than 6. So my 2/4 are going to be greater than the 2/6. This problem, we also have this number of units. These two fractions have that in common. The size of the units is different. But I know that a 7th would be a bigger piece than a 12th would be. So my 5/7 is going to be greater than my 5/12. For this problem, I want you to try it. Think about what these fractions have in common. Is it the number of units or is it the size of the unit? And then use that to determine which of these fractions is greater. So at first glance, when I look at these fractions, I look at the size of my units. This fraction I'm dealing with 7ths. In this fraction I'm dealing with 14ths. So the size of my units is different, and my total number of units is also different. So at first glance I say, well, I can't really compare these two the way that we've been learning. So the next question I want to ask myself is, can I turn one of these fractions into a new fraction that would have something in common with the other? So when I look at these denominators, 7 and 14, I know that 2/14 would be 1/7, or if I multiply 7 by 2, I would get 14. So I'm going to create an equivalent fraction. I'm going to turn my 5/7 into something over 14. 7 times 2 is 14. 5 times 2 is 10. Now my two fractions do have something in common, the size of the unit. They're both 14ths, but on this side I only have 10 of them. On this side I have 11. So I know that my 11 14ths is greater than the 10 14ths. So for this problem, ask yourself which of these fractions can you change so that it has something in common with the other one. My suggestion is to always look for the smaller number, look at those fifths, and ask yourself, can I turn my fifths into tenths? Once you find that equivalent fraction, you should be able to compare these two. And for this last problem, again, look at these fractions and ask yourself, can I turn these smaller numbers into an equivalent fraction so that it would have something in common with either the numerator, the number of units, or the denominator, the size of the units over on this side? Could I turn this into 9 pieces of something, or can I turn these fourths into a certain number of twelfths? That is it for your quiz questions this evening. Make sure you bring any questions you have back to class tomorrow, and we will continue working on it. Have a great night.